Story 1. The Haunting of Martin Hayes. In the summer of 1998, the flatlands of central Illinois were a sea of corn and silence, broken only by the occasional hum of a semi on Route 47. At the edge of a nowhere town called Gibson City, a Shell station stood like a lighthouse in the darkness, its neon sign buzzing fitfully against the starless sky. Rob Callahan, 28, was the station's night shift clerk, a man with a wiry frame, a crooked smile, and a heart heavy with unfulfilled dreams. By day, he worked the assembly line at a tire factory in Decatur, his hands stained with rubber and regret. By night, he manned the counter, counting down the hours until he could escape to Chicago or maybe California. Anywhere but here. The station was his purgatory, a fluorescent-lit cage where the air smelled of gasoline, stale coffee, and the faint tang of despair. Rob's life hadn't always been this small. He'd grown up in Gibson City, a high school quarterback with a scholarship offer to a small college in Indiana. But a knee injury his senior year had ended that dream, and a decade later, he was still here, tethered by bills, a rusting Chevy pickup, and a younger sister, Ellie, who needed help with rent after her divorce. The night shift was supposed to be a lifeline, a way to save enough for a bus ticket out. But 3 months in, the monotony had seeped into his soul. He'd memorized the hum of the cooler, the flicker of the overhead lights, the way the linoleum squeaked under his boots. His nights were a blur of restocking cigarette cartons, wiping down the coffee machine, and serving the occasional trucker or insomniac who wandered in for a Snickers or a Red Bull. Then came the stranger. It was late July, the air thick with humidity, when the bell above the door chimed at precisely 2 a.m. A tall, gaunt man stepped inside, his long, stringy hair clinging to his sweat-slicked face like wet ropes. He wore a faded flannel shirt, jeans that hung loosely on his skeletal frame, and boots caked with mud. His eyes, bloodshot and hollow, seemed to look through Rob, as if he were a ghost passing through a world he no longer belonged to. Without a word, he grabbed a tall boy of Pabst Blue Ribbon from the cooler, slapped a crumpled 5 on the counter, and shuffled out, muttering to himself. Rob watched him disappear beyond the station's lot, noting he didn't drive. No car, no headlights, just the faint scuff of boots fading into the night. The visits became a ritual, as predictable as the sunrise. Every night at 2 a.m., the door would chime, and the man Rob came to call the Drifter would appear. Rob began to dread the sound of that bell, the way the Drifter's presence seemed to drain the warmth from the room. Some nights he was talkative, his voice slurred from liquor, rambling about the government's conspiracies, the betrayal of old friends, or the weather's cruelty. Others he'd stand silently, leaning against a shelf of Doritos, staring at a wall as if it held the secrets of his broken life. Rob's curiosity grew, tinged with unease. Who was this guy? Where did he come from? Why always beer, never gas? He tried to piece together the Drifter's story, but the man was a puzzle with missing pieces, each visit revealing nothing but more shadows. One sweltering August night, the Drifter lingered longer than usual. He cracked open his tall boy right there in the store, the hiss of the can loud in the silence. "What's your name, kid?" he asked, his voice low, almost playful, but with an edge that made Rob's skin crawl. Rob hesitated, his hand tightening on the counter. "Rob," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The Drifter's lips twitched into a crooked smile. "Rob, I like that," he said, chuckling to himself as if the name were a private joke. He took a long swig, his eyes glinting with something Rob couldn't place. Amusement, maybe, or something darker. "You're all right, Rob," he said before wandering out, still laughing softly, his boots leaving faint mud tracks on the floor. The encounters grew stranger, more unsettling. The Drifter started greeting Rob with a familiar, "Hey, Rob," his tone a mix of mockery and affection that set Rob's nerves on edge. Some nights he'd stumble in, reeking of whiskey, his words a jumbled mess of curses and half-formed thoughts. Others he'd lean on a shelf for minutes, silent, his presence a weight Rob could feel in his chest. Rob began to notice details, the way the Drifter's hands trembled when he paid, the faint scars crisscrossing his knuckles, the way his eyes darted to the door as if expecting someone to follow him. He never bought gas, never mentioned a car, and always paid in cash. Crumpled bills and loose change, as if he'd scraped it from the bottom of a bottle. One night, Rob's curiosity overpowered his caution. The drifter was leaning against a shelf, staring at a wall, his beer sweating in his hand. "What's your name, man?" Rob asked, his voice cutting through the stale air. The drifter turned slowly, his eyes narrowing, as if weighing whether to answer or strike. After a long, uncomfortable pause, he said, "Bob." The name landed like a stone, too simple, too convenient. Rob's gut screamed it was a lie, but he pressed on, desperate for a crack in the drifter's armor. "So, Bob, where do you work?" The drifter's laugh was a thunderclap, sharp and unhinged, echoing in the empty store. "Work? The government screwed me out of my job, kid. Left me with nothing but this." He raised his beer can, his face twisting into a snarl. Then inexplicably, his expression softened, his eyes softening with something like pity. "I like you, Rob. You seem like you know what you're doing." He left without another word, leaving Rob to wrestle with the growing dread in his gut. As summer bled into September, the station became a pressure cooker of tension. Rob's nights were haunted by the drifter's visits, each one stretching his nerves thinner. He started keeping a baseball bat under the counter, a gift from his high school days, its grip worn but comforting. Ellie noticed the change in him, his short temper, the dark circles under his eyes, and begged him to quit. But Rob couldn't. Not yet. He needed the money, and some stubborn part of him refused to let the drifter win. Then came the storm. It rolled in on a Friday night, a biblical deluge that turned the roads to rivers and kept customers away. The wind howled, rattling the station's windows, and the neon sign flickered like a dying star. Rob was alone, the radio crackling with static, when the door chimed at 2:13 a.m. His heart sank. It was the drifter, but he was a shadow of himself. Soaked to the bone, his dark shirt and jeans clung to his skeletal frame, his hair plastered across his face like wet ropes. He stood by the door, staring blankly at the wall, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. Water pooled at his feet, and his hands twitched, as if fighting some unseen force. Rob's voice trembled as he spoke. "Bob, you okay?" The drifter didn't move, his voice a hollow whisper. "I did something really bad, Rob." The words hung in the air, heavy with menace, and Rob's blood ran cold. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. The drifter's head snapped toward him, eyes wild with a mix of fear and rage. "I need somewhere to hide." Before Rob could react, the drifter lurched past the counter, disappearing into the restroom hallway. The station felt like a tomb, the storm's roar amplifying Rob's racing pulse. He grabbed the bat, his knuckles white, and waited. Minutes crawled by, each one an eternity. The drifter didn't return. Rob's mind spun. Had he passed out? Was he sick? Or worse, was he waiting, lurking in the shadows? The power flickered, then died, plunging the station into darkness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rain's relentless drumbeat. Rob grabbed a flashlight from behind the counter, its beam trembling in his hand. He crept toward the back, where the circuit breaker was housed, his boots squeaking on the wet floor. The restroom doors were ajar, both empty. The drifter was gone, or so he thought. In the storage room, a faint dripping echoed, like a leaking faucet. Then a squeak, wet shoes on concrete. Rob's flashlight swept the room, landing on a figure in the corner. The drifter, eyes wide, face contorted with primal fury. "I'm gonna kill you!" he screamed, lunging at Rob with clawing hands. Rob swung the bat, catching the drifter's shoulder, and shoved him back, adrenaline surging. The drifter's screams echoed incoherent and feral as Rob sprinted to the front. He grabbed his raincoat, bolted to his truck, and dialed 911, his voice shaking as he explained to the operator. Rain blurred his windshield, the station's dark silhouette looming like a haunted house. Police arrived in minutes, their flashlights cutting through the deluge. They found the drifter cowering in the storage room, pupils dilated to black pools, his body trembling from something stronger than alcohol. Rob recounted everything: the visits, the threats, the confession, the attack. The officers hauled the drifter away, his incoherent mutterings fading into the storm. Weeks later, a detective called with the truth. The drifter's real name was Martin Hayes, a drifter with a rap sheet longer than Route 47. That stormy night, he'd beaten his ex-wife to death in a meth-fueled rage. Her body found in a ditch 20 miles away. The confession Rob heard was no drunken ramble. It was a killer's fleeting moment of guilt, a crack in the armor of a man unraveling. Rob quit the night shift the next day. The station's neon sign burned into his memory. He moved to Chicago 6 months later, chasing his dreams with a new ferocity. Ellie got back on her feet, and Rob found work as a mechanic, his hands finally clean of factory grime. But every time he passed a gas station at night, he'd check the shadows, half expecting to see Martin's ghost, still clutching a tall boy and whispering his name. The bat stayed in his truck, a silent reminder of the night he faced the darkness and lived. Story 2. The Phantom in the Back Seat. In the early 2000s, the suburbs of Akron, Ohio, were a labyrinth of strip malls, chain restaurants, and cul-de-sacs, a place where boredom bred rebellion. Jake Harper, 22, was the unofficial leader of the Night Owls, a ragtag crew of high school friends who lived for the thrill of late-night adventures. They'd pile into Jake's 1995 Chevy Cavalier, its dashboard littered with empty Mountain Dew cans and crumpled fast food wrappers, and cruise the empty streets until dawn. Parks, Waffle House parking lots, and abandoned Kmarts were their domain, where they'd blast Green Day, pass around a bottle of cheap vodka, and debate the meaning of life under the glow of sodium vapor lights. It was a reckless, aimless existence, but to Jake, it was freedom, a middle finger to the 9-to-5 life waiting to claim him. Jake had always been the wild one, the kid who'd sneak out at 16 to race his dad's old Mustang down back roads. He dropped out of community college after one semester, bouncing between jobs, pizza delivery, warehouse stocker, gas station attendant, never staying long enough to care. The Night Owls were his anchor, the only thing that made him feel alive. But by February 2003, the group was fraying. College had taken some, jobs others, and girlfriends had pulled a few more away. Jake clung to the ritual, unwilling to let go of the only thing that still felt like his. One frigid Saturday night, Jake and his buddy Tommy were at a park on the edge of town, their breath visible in the icy air. They'd polished off a bottle of Smirnoff, the burn of cheap vodka warming their bones. Tommy, a lanky kid with a penchant for bad jokes, was the last of the original Owls still game for these nights. They sat on a picnic table, the wood splintered and damp, trading stories about high school pranks and girls they'd never had the guts to ask out. By 3:30 a.m., the cold was winning, and Jake offered to drive Tommy home. The roads were desolate, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows across the asphalt. Tommy lived 10 miles away in a rundown apartment complex near the interstate, and Jake's gas gauge was flirting with empty by the time he dropped him off. Spotting a familiar BP station near his parents' house, Jake pulled into the lot, the pumps glowing like sentinels in the darkness. The air was sharp, biting through his flannel jacket as he stepped out. A figure brushed past him, a short, wiry man in a gray hoodie, his face half hidden by the hood's shadow. Their eyes met, and the man froze, staring at Jake with a predatory intensity that made his skin crawl. Jake's instincts screamed danger, but he brushed it off, chalking it up to the late hour. "What?" he snapped, his breath a cloud in the cold. The man said nothing, his footsteps fading into the night as he disappeared around the corner of the station. Inside the station was a time capsule of flickering fluorescence and faded posters for Camel Lights and Monster Energy. The cashier, a pimply kid barely out of high school, was engrossed in a Game Boy, the tinny music of Pokemon filling the silence. Jake paid for $20 in gas and, on a whim, bought a scratch-off lottery ticket, the kind his dad always said was a sucker's bet. The cashier barely looked up, his fingers moving mechanically across the register. Jake pocketed the ticket and headed back to his car, the cold seeping into his bones. At the pump, he filled his tank, the nozzle's rhythmic click the only sound in the still night. The lot was empty, the world asleep. He climbed into his Cavalier, tossed the ticket onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. The radio crackled to life, playing a warped, distorted version of Sweet Home Alabama that made his skin crawl. He turned it off, the silence somehow worse. The station's lights flickered in his rearview mirror as he pulled onto the road, the night swallowing the world behind him. Halfway home, a faint rustle came from the back seat, like fabric brushing against fabric. Jake's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and his heart stopped. A face stared back. The hooded man from the station, crouched low, eyes glinting like a wolf's in the dim streetlight filtering through the windows. Jake screamed, a raw, guttural wail that tore through the silence. He slammed the brakes, the Cavalier screeching to a halt in the middle of the road, tires smoking on the asphalt. "Get out!" he roared, fumbling with the door locks, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the handle. The man didn't move, his gaze locked on Jake's, unblinking, his lips curling into a faint, mocking smile. "I could have slit your throat," he said, his voice calm, almost amused, each word dripping with menace. Jake's mind raced. How had he gotten in? The car was locked, wasn't it? He checked the doors, hadn't he? Panic took over. He flung open his door, screaming for help into the empty street. Porch lights flickered on along the block, and doors creaked open as neighbors peered out, their silhouettes framed against the glow. The man slid out of the back seat, his movements slow, deliberate, like a predator savoring the hunt. "You're lucky, kid," he hissed, his breath visible in the cold. Before Jake could react, he sprinted into the darkness, his hoodie blending with the shadows. Neighbors rushed to Jake's side, their voices a blur as he stammered out what happened. A woman in a bathrobe, her hair in curlers, called the police, her voice sharp with concern. Another neighbor, a burly man in a Carhartt jacket, checked the back seat, finding nothing but a faint smell of cigarette smoke that hadn't been there before. The cops arrived within minutes, their flashlights sweeping the street. Jake explained everything. The stare, the back seat, the threat. The officers searched the car, theorizing the man had slipped in while Jake was inside paying. The Cavalier's old locks no match for a determined creep. They patrolled the neighborhood but found no trace of the man, as if he'd vanished into the night air. Jake drove home, his hands shaking on the wheel, checking his rearview mirror every few seconds. The lottery ticket sat on the passenger seat, untouched, a mocking reminder of the night he'd almost lost everything. He didn't sleep that night or the next. The night owls dissolved soon after, their late-night rituals replaced by the grind of adulthood. Jake sold the Cavalier a year later, trading it for a used Ford Focus with better locks. He got a steady job at a tire shop, started dating a girl from his old neighborhood, and tried to move on. But the memory of that face in the mirror never faded. Every time he filled up at a gas station, he'd lock his doors, scan the lot, and check the back seat, haunted by the phantom who'd come too close to ending his story. Story 3, The Silent Station. In the summer of 1965, the Atlanta suburbs were a patchwork of ambition and unease, where new subdivisions sprouted alongside old secrets, and the civil rights movement cast long shadows over the segregated South. 9-year-old Tommy Grayson rode shotgun in his father's 1963 Ford Falcon every morning, heading to the elementary school where his dad, Robert, taught history. Their commute began at 5 a.m., the world still cloaked in pre-dawn darkness, the air heavy with the promise of another sweltering day. Robert was a quiet man, a scholar at heart, with a teacher's patience and a deep love for his son. Tommy, a wiry kid with a mop of brown hair and a penchant for comic books, idolized his dad, even if he didn't always understand his lectures about the Constitution or the Civil War. To break the monotony of their 45-minute drive, they'd stop at a small, independent gas station on Old Peachtree Road, its faded sign proclaiming, "Full service with a smile." The station was a relic of a bygone era, its pumps manned by Earl Thompson, a middle-aged attendant with a quick laugh and a pocket full of change that jingled like a promise. Earl was a fixture in Tommy's young world, a man who seemed to belong to the station as much as the pumps did. His hands were stained with grease, his smile warm despite the early hour. He'd fill the Falcon's tank, wipe down the windshield, and slip Tommy a peppermint candy when Robert wasn't looking, whispering, "Don't tell your dad." Tommy adored him. The candy a secret bond between them, a small rebellion against his father's strict rules. The station's tiny bathrooms, tucked behind the pumps, were Tommy's pit stop, their cracked tiles and flickering bulbs a familiar comfort on the long drive to school. He'd race to the men's room, dodging Earl's playful swipes, and return to find his dad chatting with the attendant about the Braves' latest game or the price of gas. It was a routine as steady as the sunrise, a touchstone in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. Tommy's mom, Mary, worried about the early mornings, the long drives, the whispers of unrest in Atlanta. But Robert insisted it was fine, that the station was safe, that Earl was good people. But one muggy July morning, the routine shattered. They pulled into the station at 5:45 a.m., the sky a deep indigo, the air thick with the scent of impending rain. The lot was empty, the booth deserted. No Earl, no jingle of coins, just the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Tommy's dad frowned, his teacher's patience tested. He honked the horn once, then again, the sound sharp in the silence. Nothing. "Maybe he's in the bathroom," Robert said, his voice tinged with irritation. They waited, the minutes stretching like taffy, but no one appeared. Tommy shifted in his seat, needing to use the restroom, but sensing his dad's growing impatience. "Could be car trouble," Robert muttered, honking one last time. Still nothing. With a sigh, he started the engine. "We'll hit the next station, Tommy. We can't wait forever." They drove off, the station fading in the rearview mirror. Tommy felt a pang of unease, like they'd left something vital behind. The next station was miles away, a gleaming Esso with a surly attendant who didn't offer candy or smiles. By the time they stopped, the moment had passed, buried under the rush to get to school. But the memory of that silent morning lingered, a splinter in Tommy's mind. He asked his dad about Earl the next day, but Robert brushed it off. "Probably overslept," he said, but his eyes were troubled. 2 days later, Robert burst into the kitchen, newspaper in hand, his face ashen. "Mary, Tommy, you won't believe this," he said, his voice trembling. He read aloud a small article on page 3, his words faltering. Earl Thompson, the attendant, had been found dead in the men's bathroom, stabbed multiple times, his body crammed into a corner. The cash and coins he carried were gone, the motive pegged as robbery. The police estimated the time of death around 5:30 a.m., moments before Tommy and Robert had arrived. The article mentioned no suspects, no leads, just a grim note that the station had been Earl's life, his only family a sister in Macon. Robert's hands shook as he set the paper down. "We were there, Mary, that morning. If Tommy had gone to the bathroom..." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Mary clutched Tommy's shoulder, her eyes brimming with tears. Tommy, too young to fully grasp the horror, felt a chill settle in his bones. What if he'd opened that door? Would he have seen Earl's lifeless eyes, blood pooling on the tiles? Or worse, would he have met the killer, a shadow with a knife? The image haunted him, a shadow that grew sharper with each passing year. The family never returned to the station. They found a new route, a new routine, but the memory of that morning clung to them like damp Georgia clay. Robert became quieter, his lectures shorter, his eyes often drifting to the horizon. Mary started locking the doors at night, a habit she'd never had before. Tommy grew up, left Atlanta, and built a life in Seattle, far from the suburbs. He became a journalist, chasing stories of the forgotten, perhaps in search of answers to that silent morning. But every time he passed a gas station at dawn, he'd check the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Earl's ghost, still wiping down a windshield, his candy-filled pocket jingling in the silence. Story 4. The Desolate Pump. In the fall of 2010, Sarah Martinez was a 25-year-old paralegal in Dallas, her life a whirlwind of deadlines, ambition, and exhaustion. She'd grown up in a working-class neighborhood in San Antonio, the daughter of a mechanic and a school teacher, with dreams of becoming a lawyer. Her job at a high-powered law firm was a stepping stone, but it came with brutal hours and constant pressure. Her latest assignment, a deposition in Corpus Christi, required a 400-mile drive she could only make after her shift ended at 10 p.m. Route 281 was her lifeline, a long, straight ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Texas night. Exhausted from a 12-hour day, Sarah relied on coffee, Red Bull, and sheer willpower to stay awake, her 2005 Honda Civic humming under a sky littered with stars. Sarah was no stranger to long drives. She'd spent her college years shuttling between San Antonio and Austin, her car a sanctuary where she could blast Florence, plus the machine, and dream of a future beyond her parents' modest ranch house. But this drive felt different. The late hour, the isolation, the weight of her boss's expectations, it all pressed down on her, a heavy fog she couldn't shake. By 2 a.m., her tank was nearly empty, and her eyelids were heavy with fatigue. Spotting a Sunoco station off a desolate side road, she pulled into the lot, the flickering sign a beacon in the darkness. A rusty pickup sat near the entrance, its driver nowhere in sight. Sarah parked at a pump, her headlights sweeping the empty lot. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of diesel and dust, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote. Inside, the station was a relic of fluorescent lights and faded linoleum, the kind of place that hadn't changed since the 80s. A middle-aged cashier, his face etched with boredom, stood behind the counter, flipping through a dog-eared copy of People magazine. Another man, lanky and unshaven, paced the aisles, his eyes darting nervously, his hands stuffed in the pockets of a worn denim jacket. Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee, the machine gurgling like a dying engine. The coffee was burnt, but it was better than nothing. As she snapped a lid on the cup, the pacing man approached, his voice low and oily. "Careful, it's hot." She ignored him, her patience frayed from exhaustion, and headed to the counter. She paid for the coffee and $30 in gas, the cashier barely looking up, his fingers moving mechanically across the register. The man lingered behind her, too close, his breath sour with the scent of cheap whiskey. "I really like that top," he said, his tone dripping with false charm, his eyes raking over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Sarah forced a curt, "Thank you," her skin prickling with unease, her hand tightening on the coffee cup. He pressed further, stepping closer. "Where you headed so late?" Her temper flared, fueled by exhaustion and fear. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, loud enough to echo in the empty store. The cashier didn't react, his focus on his magazine, his indifference a silent betrayal. Outside, Sarah started pumping gas. The nozzles hummed, the only sound in the still night. Her heart was racing, her senses on high alert. Footsteps echoed on the concrete, slow and deliberate, coming from the other side of the pump. She glanced up to see the man standing there, watching her with a predator's gaze, his hands still in his pockets. No car, no gas can, just him, his eyes boring into her, unblinking. "Are you alone?" he asked, his voice a low growl, each word a step closer to danger. Sarah's heart pounded, her mind screaming to run, but she stood her ground. "No, my boyfriend's in the car," she lied, opening the driver's door to grab her pepper spray from the center console. She held it at her side, her fingers trembling but her resolve steel, her eyes never leaving his. The man inched closer, rounding the pump, his smirk widening. "I don't see anyone," he said, his voice taunting, his body language a coiled spring ready to snap. Sarah raised the pepper spray, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Back off!" He laughed, raising his hands mockingly, but retreated a few steps, his eyes never leaving hers. The pump clicked. Her tank was full, but she'd overpaid by $6. She needed her change, but the man stood between her and the shop, his presence a tangible threat, a wall she couldn't cross without risk. Steeling herself, she kept the spray raised and marched inside, her eyes locked on him, daring him to follow. The cashier handed her the change, oblivious to her distress, his apathy a knife in her gut. "That guy's making me uncomfortable," she said, her voice shaking. The cashier shrugged, muttering something in Spanish she couldn't catch, his eyes already back on his magazine. Back outside, the lot was empty, too empty. Sarah scanned the shadows, her pulse pounding, her breath shallow. Was he hiding? Waiting? She stayed on the sidewalk, unwilling to approach her car alone, the pepper spray a lifeline in her hand. Minutes dragged, the silence oppressive, the coyote's howl closer now, a reminder of the wildness beyond the station's glow. She considered calling 911, but what would she say? A man creeped her out? She had no proof, no crime to report. Yet, the weight of her vulnerability pressed down, a reminder of every warning her mother had drilled into her about being a woman alone at night. A pickup truck rumbled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. A burly man with a graying beard climbed out, his boots heavy on the pavement, his flannel shirt straining against his broad shoulders. Sarah saw her chance. She approached him, her voice trembling but firm. "Can you check if someone's behind my car?" she asked, her eyes pleading. He frowned, confused, but nodded, sensing her fear. He circled her Civic, his flashlight sweeping the shadows. "What are you doing?" he bellowed, and Sarah's heart leapt. The creepy man scrambled from behind her car, his denim jacket catching on the bumper as he sprinted into the darkness beyond the lot, his footsteps swallowed by the night. "Be careful out there," the bearded man said, his southern drawl thick with concern, his eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting the man to return. Sarah peeled out of the lot, her hands gripping the wheel, her eyes darting to every shadow. The rest of her drive was a blur, the memory of that smirk burning in her mind, a brand she couldn't erase. She stopped at another station an hour later, this one bustling with truckers and fluorescent safety. But the fear lingered, a passenger she couldn't shake. She never learned who the man was or what he wanted, but the certainty that he'd been waiting to pounce haunted her, a shadow that followed her through every late-night drive. Sarah bought a new car the next year, one with better locks and an alarm, but she never drove Route 281 at night again. The pepper spray stayed in her purse, a silent guardian against the ghosts of that desolate pump. She made it to Corpus Christi, nailed the deposition, and got the promotion, but the victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the night she'd faced the darkness and survived. Story 1: The Vanishing in the Pines. The pine barrens of South Jersey stretched endlessly under a moonless sky, their gnarled trees casting jagged shadows across the lonely road. Officer Daniel Harper, a 35-year-old veteran of the local police force, gripped the wheel of his cruiser, his eyes scanning the darkness. 10 years on the job had taught him to trust his instincts, and tonight, those instincts were screaming. The air felt charged, as if the forest itself was watching, waiting for something to break the silence. It was 3:04 a.m. when Harper's headlights caught a flicker of red on the roadside, a pair of taillights glowing faintly through the mist. The vehicle, a rusted sedan, sat half off the pavement, its driver's side door flung open, swaying gently in the breeze. Harper's pulse quickened. This wasn't a breakdown. Something was wrong. He radioed dispatch, his voice low but steady. "Suspicious vehicle, Route 539, mile marker 47, investigating." Stepping out of his cruiser, Harper's boots sank into the soft earth. The woods loomed on both sides, their branches clawing at the sky. His flashlight beam cut through the fog, revealing the sedan's interior. A wave of nausea hit him as a stench rolled out, rotting flesh, sharp and suffocating. He gagged, covering his nose with his sleeve, but pressed forward. The passenger seat was a slaughterhouse. Blood-soaked tissues and paper towels, some still wet, were strewn across the floor, their dark stains glinting in the light. Harper's heart pounded. He swept his flashlight across the woods, calling out, "South Jersey Police! Anyone out there?" His voice was swallowed by the trees, the silence mocking him. Then a snap, a twig breaking underfoot, deep in the underbrush. He froze, his hand dropping to his holster. "Show yourself!" he shouted, his beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing, just the wind. Or so he told himself. He returned to the sedan, his eyes drawn to the back seat. A bundle wrapped in bloodied paper towels sat ominously still. With gloved hands, Harper peeled back the layers, his breath hitching as the object revealed itself. A severed human hand, its fingers curled like claws, the skin a sickly gray. He stumbled back, his mind racing. This wasn't an accident. This was a crime scene. Harper radioed for backup, his voice tight. "Possible homicide. Need K 9 units in forensics now." As he waited, the woods seemed to close in, their silence oppressive. Footsteps, deliberate, heavy, cracked through the undergrowth. He spun, his gun drawn, his flashlight catching only shadows. A low, guttural voice rumbled from the trees, its words unintelligible but dripping with menace. "Come out now!" Harper barked, his heart hammering. No response. Just the echo of that voice burrowing into his mind. Backup arrived in a flurry of lights and sirens. K-9 units swept the woods, their handlers shouting commands as dogs strained against their leashes. But the forest gave up nothing. No blood trails, no footprints, no sign of the figure Harper had seen fleeing into the night. The sedan was towed to the impound lot, where it was identified as stolen from a nearby town. Fingerprints lifted from the steering wheel, and DNA from the hand led nowhere. No matches in any database. Days turned into weeks, then months. Harper threw himself into the case, poring over missing persons reports, chasing leads that evaporated like smoke. He interviewed the sedan's owner, a nervous mechanic who swore he'd never seen the car after it was stolen from his driveway. Harper didn't buy it. The man's eyes darted too much, his hands trembling as he spoke. But without evidence, the trail went cold. The case haunted Harper. Late at night, when the precinct was quiet, he'd sit at his desk, the case file spread out before him. He'd replay the scene, the tail lights, the stench, the hand, and that voice, low, inhuman, whispering from the dark. He started taking the long way home, avoiding Route 539, but the woods seemed to follow him, their shadows creeping into his dreams. One night, nearly a year later, Harper received an anonymous tip, a grainy photo sent to the precinct, showing a man in a hooded jacket standing near a familiar sedan. The timestamp was recent, the location just miles from where Harper had found the car. Against protocol, he drove out alone, his cruiser cutting through the fog. The woods were waiting, their silence heavier than ever. As he stepped onto the roadside, his flashlight caught a glint of red in the distance. Taillights glowing faintly through the mist. Harper's blood ran cold. The sedan was back. Story 2. The Labyrinth of Shadows. The fog was thick as Officer Sarah Delgado and her partner Marcus Tate navigated the crumbling streets of their county's underbelly. They were part of the sheriff's department, tasked with hunting down parolees who cut their ankle monitors and vanished into the night. Tonight, their target was Camille, a 28-year-old woman who'd slipped her tether and disappeared. Her last known location was a rotting house in a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered and the air smelled of despair. The house stood at the end of a dead-end street, its sagging roof and boarded windows giving it the look of a corpse left to decay. Delgado, a sharp-witted cop with a knack for reading people, felt a chill as they approached. Tate, a burly veteran who preferred action to intuition, muttered, "This place looks like it's been dead for decades." But Delgado's gut told her otherwise. Something was alive in there. Something wrong. Tate took the front door, his fist pounding against the splintered wood. Delgado positioned herself at the side of the house, her flashlight sweeping the overgrown yard. The air was heavy, the silence broken only by the faint drip of a leaking gutter. Then from inside, a shuffle, soft, deliberate. The door creaked open, and a woman's face appeared, her eyes sunken, her skin ashen. She didn't look at Tate. Instead, her gaze locked onto Delgado, standing in the shadows, invisible from any window. Delgado's heart skipped a beat. How does she know I'm here? The woman, frail and unsteady, mumbled that Camille was inside. Before they could press her, she collapsed to her hands and knees, scooting across the floor like a broken machine, her voice rising in a wail. "Camille! Camille!" Delgado and Tate exchanged a glance. This wasn't just mental illness. This was something deeper, something that made the hairs on Delgado's neck stand on end. They stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the sour tang of mildew. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. The living room was a labyrinth of clutter, piles of moldy newspapers, shattered furniture, and strange hand-drawn symbols etched into the plaster. Delgado's flashlight lingered on one, a spiral with jagged lines like a scream frozen in ink. As they searched, the woman trailed them, never rising from the floor, her cries for Camille growing more frantic. The house seemed to defy reality. Hallways twisted back on themselves. Doors led to rooms that shouldn't exist. And every time Delgado turned a corner, she felt like she'd stepped into a different house entirely. "This place is messing with us," she whispered to Tate, who nodded, his hand resting on his holster. Upstairs, they found a door sealed shut, its edges crusted with dried paint. Tate shouldered it open, revealing an attic, its rafters draped in cobwebs, the air thick with the smell of decay. A single light bulb swayed from a frayed cord, its glow illuminating a pile of old photographs scattered across the floor. Delgado picked one up, a young woman, smiling, her arms around a child. The resemblance to the woman downstairs was uncanny. The search dragged on, the house seeming to stretch time itself. Rooms looped endlessly, shadows shifted without cause, and the woman's cries for Camille became a haunting refrain. At one point, Delgado turned to find the woman inches behind her, silent as a specter, her eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "Jesus!" Delgado gasped, her hand flying to her gun. The woman didn't flinch, just stared, her lips moving soundlessly. After what felt like hours, they found a hidden room behind a false wall in the basement. Inside was a shrine, candles, photos, and a child's toy, all arranged around a faded picture of the same young woman from the attic. Delgado's stomach twisted. "Camille," she whispered. But the room was empty, the air cold and still. They cleared the house, but the official report, 20 minutes on scene, didn't capture the truth. The house had held them for what felt like days, its walls whispering secrets they couldn't decipher. As they drove away, Delgado glanced back to see the woman standing in the doorway, her silhouette stark against the dim light, staring after them with an intensity that burned into her soul. Back at the station, Delgado dug into Camille's file. She'd been a foster child, placed with the woman years ago, but had vanished after a string of hospitalizations. The woman, it turned out, had been diagnosed with severe schizophrenia, her grip on reality slipping long before Camille disappeared. But the shrine, the photos, the house, they told a different story. Delgado couldn't shake the feeling that Camille was still out there, trapped in the labyrinth of that house, or in the mind of the woman who called her name. Story 3, The Grave of Innocence. In the heart of Georgia's peach country, where the air was thick with the scent of fruit and regret, Officer Robert "Bob" Callahan answered a call that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Bob was a man of quiet conviction, a cop who joined the force to make a difference in a world that often seemed indifferent. At 30, he was still optimistic, still believed in the good fight. But on that humid August evening, as he and his partner, Officer Lena Hayes, pulled up to a decaying house between Macon and Roberta, that belief would be shattered. The house was a monument to neglect, its porch sagging, its windows boarded with splintered plywood. Locals called it the ghost house, swearing it had been empty for decades. But the call had come from a neighbor, her voice trembling. "Screams," she said, and a man sobbing on the front steps. As Bob and Hayes approached, they saw him, an older man, his face buried in his hands, his body racked with sobs. His clothes were stained, his hair wild, and he muttered, "It's awful, so awful." Hayes knelt beside him, her voice steady. "Sir, what happened? Are you hurt?" The man didn't respond, his words dissolving into a stream of anguish. Bob's gut twisted. He'd seen grief before, but this was different, raw, as if the man had seen something no human should. Hayes called for paramedics, but Bob couldn't wait. The air around the house felt wrong, heavy with a stench that clawed at his throat. Rotting food, decay, and something darker. Drawing his gun, Bob stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The interior was a nightmare. Stacks of moldy takeout containers, pots and pans piled to the ceiling, and walls smeared with unidentifiable stains. The smell was unbearable, a physical force that made his eyes water. He called out, "Police! Anyone here?" Silence answered, but it was a silence that watched, that waited. Bob moved through the living room, his flashlight catching glimpses of chaos. Overturned furniture, a child's toy crushed underfoot, and a photograph, half buried under debris, showing a smiling couple with a toddler. The image felt like a violation in this place of ruin. The smell grew worse as he approached a hallway, the air so thick he gagged. Covering his mouth, he pushed open a door to a bedroom. The sight stopped him cold. Two bodies lay on a filthy mattress, their skin gray and peeling, flies swarming in a frenzied dance. Bob's stomach lurched, but he forced himself closer. The man and woman were long dead, their faces frozen in agony. And then he saw it. Clutched in the woman's arms, a smaller body, an infant, its tiny form lifeless, a cockroach scuttling across its face. Bob stumbled back, his vision blurring, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He fled the house, collapsing on the steps, vomiting until his throat burned. Hayes was at his side, her face pale but composed. "What did you see?" she asked. Bob shook his head, unable to form the words. The image was seared into his mind. The infant, the flies, the unbearable weight of loss. The investigation revealed a tragedy born of despair. The couple, John and Mary Ellis, had spiraled into opioid addiction after Mary's surgery left her dependent on painkillers. Their addiction consumed their lives, their home, and their daughter Lily, who died of neglect at just 2 years old. Overwhelmed by grief, they'd overdosed, their bodies left to rot alongside their child's. The man on the steps was a former co-worker, a friend who'd come to check on John after he stopped showing up to work. He'd been the first to find the scene, his mind shattered by the horror. Bob stayed on the force, but the case broke him. He turned to whiskey to dull the nightmares, each one replaying Lily's lifeless face, her cries echoing in his dreams. Hayes, worried for her partner, pushed him to seek therapy. Slowly, Bob clawed his way back, but the scars remained. He took a desk job, unable to face the streets where ghosts lingered. Years later, a package arrived at the precinct addressed to Bob. Inside was a single photograph, the same one he'd seen in the house, showing John, Mary, and Lily smiling. On the back, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "She's still crying." Bob burned the photo, but the words stayed with him, a reminder that some wounds never heal. Story 4. The Silent Threat. The call came at 12:47 a.m., a young woman's voice trembling through the static. "Someone's in my house." Officer Emily Voss, a 3-year veteran with a reputation for staying cool under fire, listened as the woman, Claire Ramsey, described coming home to a broken window, hearing footsteps downstairs after she'd gone to bed. Then abruptly the call cut off. Dispatch tried to reconnect, but the line stayed dead. Voss's instincts kicked into overdrive. She grabbed her keys and sped toward the address, her cruiser slicing through the suburban night. The house was a modest 2-story, its windows dark except for a faint glow upstairs. Voss approached the front door, her flashlight sweeping the porch. She knocked, waited, then knocked again, harder, ringing the doorbell for good measure. Silence. Her gut screamed that time was running out. Circling the house, she found the broken window in the kitchen, shards of glass scattered like jagged teeth. It was big enough for someone to climb through without effort. Voss radioed dispatch. Possible B&E entering through the window. She climbed inside, her boots crunching on the glass, her gun drawn. The kitchen was dark, the air heavy with the scent of stale coffee and something sharper, fear. "Police!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the house. No response. She moved through the kitchen, her flashlight cutting through the shadows, her senses on high alert. Claire had mentioned hearing footsteps downstairs, which meant she was likely upstairs. Voss climbed the stairs, her steps deliberate but quiet, her gun steady. "Ma'am, it's the police. Are you here?" she called. A soft voice answered from a bedroom. "Yes." Voss followed the sound, her heart pounding but her focus razor sharp. In the bedroom, Claire sat upright in bed, her face pale in the moonlight. She was young, barely 25, her eyes wide with terror. Voss kept the lights off, relying on the natural light to read Claire's expression. "Are you okay?" she asked. Claire nodded, but her voice trembled. "I'm fine." Voss caught the lie. Something was wrong. "Why'd you hang up?" Voss pressed, her eyes scanning the room. Claire stuttered. "No one's here." Voss's gaze flicked to the closet, then under the bed. She tilted her head slightly, a silent question. Claire's eyes darted downward, a barely perceptible nod. Voss's blood ran cold. Someone was under the bed. Thinking fast, Voss improvised. "Ma'am, I need you to sign a report stating I was here, and everything's fine," she said, her tone casual but firm. Claire hesitated, then slid out of bed, crossing the room toward Voss. As she drew close, Voss grabbed her arm and pulled her out of the room, shutting the door behind them. Spinning back, she drew her gun and shouted, "Come out from under the bed, now!" A dark shape emerged, slow and deliberate, from under the bed. "Hands first," Voss barked. A clatter, a gun hitting the floor. A man, middle-aged and dressed in black, rose with his hands up, his face a mask of defiance. Voss cuffed him, her heart still racing, and marched him outside just as backup arrived. Claire's story came out in fragments. She'd hung up when she heard the intruder creeping upstairs, afraid he'd hear her on the phone. He'd entered her room, gun in hand, and ordered her to stay silent, threatening to kill her if she alerted the police. When Voss arrived, he'd hidden under the bed, forcing Claire to play along. Voss's quick thinking had saved her life. The man, identified as Richard Hale, was a serial burglar with a history of escalating violence. But the case didn't end there. Voss dug deeper, uncovering a pattern of similar break-ins across the state, all linked to Hale. She worked with detectives, piecing together evidence that led to his conviction, not just for Claire's case, but for a string of crimes that had terrorized the region. Claire moved away, unable to feel safe in the house. Voss, though, carried the call with her, a reminder of how close she'd come to losing someone, and how her instincts had made the difference. At the station, her colleagues called her a hero. Voss just shrugged. "Just doing my job," she'd say. But late at night, she'd replay the moment she saw that nod, the moment she knew she'd won. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered if Hale had been working alone, or if someone else was still out there, waiting in the dark.